It's a very special day here in the studio. We're joined by Jim Jatras, a guest. He's an attorney, a Washington-based government and media specialist who was previously a U.S. diplomat and U.S. Senate staffer. He's also editor of a great website I found when I Googled something. I think I looked up, why is FATCA so stupid? Not expecting to get many hits, but I found repealfatca.com, a website dedicated to getting rid of the worst law most Americans have never heard of. So thank you so much for joining us today, Jim. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Jim also recently notified all the declared Republican presidential candidates of his availability and qualifications to join them on the 2016 ticket as their vice presidential running mate. Great quote in an interview you had. He said, "I'm interested in the job, which a lot of people aren't." And Jim, I think that's great because you don't hear people say, I want to be vice president because I want to be vice president. They want to be vice president for a myriad of other reasons.
That's right. And of course, often it's suspected that people who are running for president but don't have much chance of getting the nomination are really running for vice president, but none of them really say so. You sometimes hear somebody say, well, I want to be his vice president, like Jesse Ventura, who's not a Republican, said he might be interested in running with Trump. But what you don't hear is somebody saying, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat, and I would like to be the nominee of my party, whoever our party's presidential nominee is. So I figured nobody else has ever done so. So why shouldn't I suggest myself in that role? And I figure my chances are no worse than, say, Jim Gilmore's or Ben Carson's at this point of getting the presidential nomination.
Now, here's a question for you. Who is the vice president that you most aspire to be like? Which might be a different question than who is your favorite vice president?
Well, I suppose it would be one of the vice presidents who became president, like Teddy Roosevelt.
All right. Well, one of the reasons we asked Jim onto the program is because we did just do a whole series about FATCA, sort of looking more at the ridiculousness of it. And like I said, when I found that website, I was just so excited. Not a lot of people know about it. Not a lot of people talk about it, but they should. And I think the first place to start with FATCA, Jim, is a question to you. What is your opinion on worldwide tax jurisdiction? Good idea or not?
I think it's a terrible idea. I think we have to make a distinction between what I'm sure people are familiar with, citizen-based taxation, which the United States has, and residence-based taxation, which almost every other country in the world has. But I think we need to keep in mind that FATCA goes way beyond just the effects of citizen-based taxation to what can properly be called worldwide jurisdiction, where the United States, American law and American regulation, claims authority not only over our citizens, which is bad enough in some respects, but over every foreign institution, indeed over every foreign government in the world, in effect threatening them with sanctions if they don't submit to our jurisdiction. And I think this is something of really breathtaking consequence that really has not been adequately discussed.
Sort of hidden there. And years ago, I would disagree with anyone who would claim the U.S. is an empire. But as you go through its taxing policies, it's like this is the most clever empire because it's not obvious. It's this passive-aggressive control over the world with this hidden stuff, somewhere hidden behind some bill that only very few people know it impacts. Only very few people know how the costs are passed on to people, and most people just sort of walk around not knowing what exactly is going on. Here's one question for you, Jim. Claudine and I were doing a video on sort of what happens if a foreign bank tells the U.S. government, you know what, we're just not going to comply with FATCA. We're not assisting anyone in tax evasion. We know we're not. We just don't feel like doing this. And we're looking at the penalties that or how the U.S. government would put a penalty on a foreign bank, and basically they're allowed to, what we found, and this seems to be the only thing that they can really do, is withhold up to 30% of any payments outbound from the U.S. Destined for that foreign financial institution. And so we're wondering, my question would be two parts. Is that the only penalty that you can think of? And second of all, how the heck do you enforce this? Because where's the list that I would go to? Where's this list of banks that aren't complying with FATCA? And then, I guess this would be the third part, isn't this the easiest, isn't there an incredibly easy workaround that a foreign bank would just have some sort of subsidiary that's not even a foreign financial institution in order to take outbound U.S. payments?
You're right. That is the sanction penalty that is applied in sanction. In fact, I'm not sure it is so easy to work around. Of course, the situation has gotten a lot more complicated because of the intergovernmental agreements that I'm sure we will discuss in a bit. But just if taking straight FATCA the way it's written, I don't know that it would be so easy to work around that, because every U.S. financial institution that is going to be sending money to anybody overseas, there's going to be some identified recipient institution on the other side. And if you set up some shell company which would be acting as a financial institution for the purpose of the transfer, you're going to find out, are they FATCA compliant? Are they subject to the IGA signed by their country and so forth? So I don't think it would be that easy to do. So this is considered by most FFIs, and the reason they knuckled under so quickly, as something close to a death penalty. If you can't do business financially in transactions that involve the United States, and how much international financial traffic doesn't involve the United States at one point or another, you're basically frozen out of not only the American market, but the world financial system, and they know that.
Yes. Yeah. We assumed it was more of like an unspoken sanction. Like, 30% is what we're going to put out so everybody can see. But the unspoken sanction is we will cut you off.
So really, so to say, I think any outbound money going to that foreign financial institution, regardless of who it's from, is subject to that 30%. So, that's pretty rough. If a bank was trying to get around it, they would have to open up an account in a bank that was FATCA compliant.
Sure.
And then they could kind of work around, but then that bank would probably...
Well, no, there's no problem. That's what they call the pass-through provisions, too. It works that there's a pro rata requirement to compliant institutions with regard to their relationship with non-compliant institutions. So let's suppose there were no IGA signed by Germany, and you had two German banks, one FATCA compliant and one not. The compliant bank would be obligated to itself deduct 30% pro rata on any money being transferred to the non-compliant bank.
Gotcha. All right. Now, we had also already touched on that this supposedly was created to offset the cost of the Hire Act. Do you think that's true? How did this manage to sort of slip in as law?
Well, I think we need to make a distinction between the why and the how. The how is fairly mechanical. Once something gets scored as either costing so much money or bringing in so much money, you might say it's sitting on the shelf with what they're looking for pay-for provisions. So when they have a bill like a jobs bill, like the Hire Act, and they say, we need to pay for this with $3 billion, whatever it's going to cost, and they start rummaging around for what's available, they say, here's this FATCA thing. That'll give us $800 billion a year. Okay, there's one. It was almost as simple and as stupid as that. The FATCA law was never debated or voted on or amended on the floor of either House of Congress. There were never separate hearings held on FATCA. There are lots of hearings on the problem of offshore tax evasion, but nothing about FATCA as a mechanism to fix it and how it would work to try to address that issue. And in fact, of course, it probably will not really do anything about real, true, fat cat criminally minded tax evaders. They are going to be clever enough and devious enough to put their money to real estate and gems and art and all the other things that are not covered by FATCA. You hear a lot of talk about... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Pallets of cash.
Sure, exactly.
There's nothing. You can have a warehouse of cash.
That's right. And the people it will catch are essentially middle-class people who probably have some filing deficiencies, have never even, maybe in most cases, never even thought that they owed any tax, and maybe don't owe any tax. You have a lot of accidental Americans who didn't even know they were Americans and had a filing requirement under U.S. law, but will get smacked pretty hard with legal fees and penalties. It won't even bring any revenue probably on the tax side significantly, although they will collect some penalties.
We had even said it's more the higher middle class, and it's people you sort of want to be able to spin around and confuse.
Exactly.
The fat cats have got a great legal team behind them to fight for them, where the average person may not know, I can hire an attorney or take care of this myself.
Or I think worse is they don't think that they're a real target. They're like, well, no, the IRS has to be reasonable. I didn't do anything wrong. And that just, it turns my stomach, and it's something that I've seen happen a lot of times. People represent themselves because, well, hiring an attorney would make me look guilty. And plus, hey, look, it's just the government. The government wouldn't completely screw me over to just, prove a point.
Truth and justice.
Right, truth and justice. And I think that's one of the biggest problems with America today is there's still this bias that America is about truth and justice. And, 240 years ago, is that what we're at now? About 240 years ago,
right,
when this country was founded, there seemed to be a lot more righteous suspicion of a governmental power. Now, is that something that you would tend to agree with, Jim?
I would. It's funny. I'm distinctly on the conservative side of the spectrum, and I notice how many of my fellow conservatives especially tend to be quite critical of the federal government as it acts here in the United States, but they seem to think that when the same federal government ventures abroad, it's all truth, justice, and the American way and mom and apple pie, not the same overbearing, arrogant diktat that we experience here at home. FATCA, aside from its stupidity as a tax enforcement mechanism, just from the point of view of international law, of international comity between states, it's just a phenomenally destructive thing that one country, and in this case ours, decrees to the rest of the world that you must submit to the legal and regulatory jurisdiction of our administrative agencies at the price of crushing financial sanctions. I mean, think how we would feel if, say, the Chinese government passed a law that American firms had to comply with Chinese law, and if they refused to do so, the following sanctions, assuming they were in a position to enforce a sanction like we can, the following sanction would be imposed upon them. Let's suppose they were in a position to do that, actually hurt us. How would we feel about that? We would consider that some kind of aggression, and indeed it is. But we're doing that to the rest of the world, and for no real benefit to us, because I don't think this will really raise very much money at all, even if that were an excuse. That's what we're doing. I think it's very destructive to the whole concept of a law-based international system, and also of the concept of sovereignty.
Absolutely. And Jim, you mentioned $800 million before. Was that just a figure that this was going to raise per year, or was that something that was claimed, or you were just saying that as
No, that's the number that they gave in I think it was the Joint Tax Committee scored at when it was passed. But keep in mind, there was no cost study. How they came up with that number, I've never been able to ascertain. And of course, it's a piddling amount. It's enough to run the U.S. government for 2 hours every year.
Is it 2 hours? I think you'd have a hard time. I mean, $800 million is nothing, and I was reading around just sort of the cost of compliance. It's something like $2 billion a year.
It could be a lot more than that. It depends on how you, for example, the Bank of Nova Scotia in Canada itself, one bank has spent over $100 million complying with FATCA. Now, if you take any large bank that size around the world, it's going to be a comparable cost. You're well into the billions right there. Now, is that a one-time thing? How much will they be paying going forward? How much is sunk cost? I don't think we really know.
Now, Jim, you're a Republican. I am a Republican as well. When I started this, I wasn't nearly as radical as I am. Every day that it goes on, I become more and more radical. Can you tell me how many votes the Hire Act got from the Republicans?
I don't recall the exact number. I don't think it was very high.
It's a round figure. I'll give you a hint. It's very round. It's zero.
That doesn't surprise me. Remember, this was at the time when the Democrats controlled the White House and both houses of Congress, so the steamroller just moved. That's all.
Well, I think it's something important for people to know, because there's something like 7 million expats, and that's a significant 7 million expats. And how many people in the U.S. have some sort of connection with a foreign country where they have assets abroad?
That's right.
You're talking about a significant voting block that if somebody decided to say, hey, wait a second, you know what? No one's listening to these people. Let me go and listen to these people. it's the fertile ground. There's nobody competing for these votes. Just go in. A lot of these people, and this is sort of an aside, a lot of these people are by default Democrat because they think those are the good people.
Right.
And it's just sort of infuriating. It's like, these are the people who are making your life hell. These are the people who are doing all these things, who insist on worldwide taxation. These are the ones who are pushing for it. These aren't your buddies. These really aren't. So I guess why can't some Republican, because I don't see a Democrat do it, I think Bernie Sanders would want to tax everybody a little bit more. If he could tax 110%, he would. So I guess why can't we get some some Republican candidate to say, hey, who hates FATCA?
Well, obviously the point man out in this so far has been Rand Paul, who pulled out of the presidential race recently. I worked closely with his office in introducing his repeal FATCA bill that was introduced first in 2013 and again in 2014. But, again, that was sort of a demonstration thing. It was an attempt to show the rest of the world, look, this can be done. If we mount a lobbying effort and also a media education effort to show why this is a bad law, bad for America, not just for expats, not just for foreign institutions, but just bad policy all around. I think we could make something of it. Unfortunately, it really did not attract the attention. As far as the expat groups go, you have Republicans overseas which have filed a suit against FATCA. You have Democrats abroad which have essentially been more partisan than helpful to their members, trying to talk about a same country exclusion or something like that, which they'd be lucky to get, and I don't think they'll even get that. But for example, one of the things they ought to be doing, and I've suggested this and haven't gotten much of a response, is to form a PAC. If you want politicians to pay attention, you don't just write them letters. You don't just visit with their offices once a year. You form a PAC and talk to them in the language which they understand. You make contributions to their campaigns or to their opponents' campaigns, depending on whether they're with you or against you. And that hasn't been done yet.
It reminds me, we deal a lot with tax issues here. And when we talk about tax protesters, and, it's like they've got the best intentions, but when it comes to something like taxes and FATCA, as much as you don't agree with it, you're not going to screw the government. You can't trick them. So I think it's sort of our goal every day to come in and say, all right, you know what, we can't fight them, but what we can do is at least start to educate people and, stand on your soapbox and say, this is screwed up. At least bring attention to the matter.
That's right.
Yeah, I think that's.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, Jim, talk to someone like you who's just organized, and by the way, I've learned more from FATCA from you than anyone else. So it's the person opposed to the thing knows more about it than anybody else. You gotta love that. Well, maybe that's why he's opposed to it, because he does know so much about it. Talking to you is great because we get people frustrated and they just sort of flail their arms, and there's not that organization. If you're not organized, forget about it. You don't have anything. And when I kind of sometimes I get myself a little worked up, and then we had a podcast a little bit where we were talking about tax shelters and how they came about. Various tax shelters, every group that's looking for some preferential treatment, they did the hard work.
Right.
They did years and years of hard work of meeting with politicians. Who wants to meet with a politician, right? I mean, there's a few I wouldn't mind meeting, but for the most part, it's a rough business. And they're having them at their house. They're doing a fundraiser year after year after year. Even when they have the legislation they want, they continue. Well, look, we don't want to lose it. We're going to continue the hard work. And so I think that's something important. Like if you look at the Hollywood tax cuts, if you look at how the insurance industry gets what they want, look at all that hard work they're putting into getting what they want. It's showing you it can be done. It just doesn't happen with an angry letter.
And that's right. It doesn't happen by itself. And by the way, this is where I would say the real dereliction of duty is from the financial industry, both domestically and even more so abroad. I mentioned the $100 million spent by Bank of Nova Scotia. Suppose they had put 1%, 1/10 of 1% of that into fighting FATCA or the other financial institutions, but they didn't do that. And part of it is two things. One is an incredible level of ignorance, especially in the foreign financial community, about how things work in this country. I recall a headline, I think it was in the South China Morning Post, about financial institutions in Hong Kong saying, we are going to fight FATCA. We are writing a letter to the Treasury Department to urge them to repeal it. And, first up, we don't have a parliamentary system. The Treasury Department doesn't pass laws or repeal laws. The other thing, and this relates to something you all talked about on an earlier program about don't blame the tax advisors, don't blame the people involved in helping people comply. And I've been very critical of the compliance industry, and I don't mean you. I don't mean the people who help ordinary individual taxpayers deal with this monstrosity. What I do mean primarily is the big accounting firms, some of the big law firms, the big software firms, who much earlier than I had supposed had gotten to the financial industry and seen what a bonanza FATCA was going to be for these rather large firms. Those billions of dollars are going somewhere. And once they had sunk those costs, who are the executives at the big banks or the big insurance companies who are going to turn around and say, you mean we didn't have to spend $100 million complying with this dog? We could have tried to get it overturned, repealed in Congress? They're not going to do that. And I'm afraid the well was poisoned much earlier on than I had anticipated.
Yeah, we've seen, and I think a bunch of the accounting firms do lobby Congress to make sure that things are kept complicated. And I believe there was, and we did a blog on it, and it was one of the big like TurboTax or so Intuit. I think it was Intuit, or no, it was H&R Block, who said, do not simplify the earned income tax credit form, because whatever their reason was. Well, the thing is, the Treasury Inspector General looked at H&R Block's error rate. I think it was there, and it was significantly higher than self-prepared returns. So the people who were lobbying to keep things as complicated as possible were the people who couldn't even do the complicated thing, and yet I don't think they got their way on that one. I think the IRS said, look, we can't fix all your errors. We don't have time.
But you're right. It's that kind of influence, persistence, and essentially commitment of resources that pays off, and that unfortunately has been entirely missing from the FATCA situation. And the tragedy of it is, look, I've been involved in politics in this town for a long time and in legislation. This thing could be knocked over with a feather, but we don't have a feather. It really does not have, people abroad especially think it's this huge juggernaut that the United States is committed to. I remember one German diplomat telling me, I know this about the Americans, when they are committed to something, they do it. And I was saying, which Americans? I don't think, even today, I don't think 1 in 10 congressmen or senators could tell you what FATCA was. If you said, what do you think of FATCA? They'd say, what's that?
Yeah.
There is no huge pro-FATCA lobby here. It is something that is rolled on by inertia and by some very clever maneuvering by the Treasury Department on the whole question of the IGAs, which are not part of FATCA, and without which the whole thing would come crashing down.
Well, you know what? That's a good. I really want to get into the IGAs right now because when I was reading Rand Paul's lawsuit, and there was an argument which I didn't really consider until I was reading that. But it was something like, well, why don't you tell me what the argument was? Because it was something about the IGAs conflicting with international law. Was that what it was?
Well, I think one of the I'm trying to remember what was said in you're talking about the lawsuit filed by Republicans overseas, and in which Senator Paul's one of the plaintiffs.
Right.
Part of his argument, of course, was it was circumventing the Senate's treaty power, since these are not treaties and they're not being submitted to the Senate for advice and consent, although they are being treated as treaties by the foreign government that actually do ratify them as though they're treaties, and then pass domestic legislation to implement them. So they're talking about Stockholm syndrome. The other argument that was being made, which I thought was a rather peculiar one, although it might have some legal merit, is that the Treasury Department is obligated to enforce FATCA, that by implementing the IGA, they are not directly enforcing FATCA, but rather they are using the IGA as a mechanism to accomplish the same end, but not following the statutory path of law. And I'm not sure about the merits of the argument legally, because the FATCA does give the Secretary of the Treasury very wide waiver authority for exempting institutions. It was basically saying, I don't have to come and take your information by force if your government will kindly require you to give it to me. So I'm not sure legally how that works out.
Okay.
But the real problem with the IGAs is that they're neither fish nor fowl. They're not treaties. They're not domestic statutes. They are not treaty-based documents of a sort that exist in many forms. They are essentially faux treaties, fake treaties that the Senate is not being given a chance to give advice and consent. The trouble is I don't know how you challenge them. Maybe you can do it legally, but right now it looks like they're going to get away with it.
Right. There's no way to challenge it because it's somebody who's, I guess they could say, well, they're voluntarily giving it to us.
That's right. And that's the other interesting thing about this is that if foreign governments had said to the United States, hey, we're not doing this. This is an infringement on our sovereignty. We will not obey this. We will not cause our institutions to obey this. It would have been difficult for smaller countries, but a big country, I'm thinking particularly of Canada, had said to us, we're not doing this. And we will find ways. We'll start to. They're our biggest trading partner. If you take 30% out of wires going to Canadian institutions, then we'll start deducting 30% from wires going to American institutions. Let's see what you want to do about your overflights from Europe if they can't come through Canada. If you want to play hardball here. But the trouble is who is the number one institution pushing for compliance? The Canadian Bankers Association, because they were convinced by the big compliance firms, there is no alternative. We must submit. What's the biggest obstacle to FATCA? Something that was not anticipated in the law is that financial institutions legally, in most cases, can't comply with FATCA directly because it would violate their own domestic privacy laws. So the number one reason for the IGAs is to have the governments of those countries abrogate their own privacy laws so that they can then comply.
Wow.
That's right, because we deal with the people from all over the world, and something that happens, and sort of the punishment that U.S. persons get in the financial industries. Let's say you're a U.S. person and you're the custodian of a Chinese person's account, and that Chinese person doesn't want anyone to know they have that money, with good reason. Yeah. Well, you're that U.S. person, and I know it has nothing to do with FATCA, but you have an FBAR filing requirement, and that all these laws, this FATCA and the Bank Secrecy Act, all make Americans less competitive. But they're looking, well, it doesn't affect enough people. It's not, it doesn't affect enough people directly. Is I think some of the issues, and you just see how horrible it is to be a U.S. person. And if you were at any point a U.S. person, it can be very difficult. I spoke with a woman in Costa Rica who was here on a visa for 10 years with her husband, UK citizen, and gave it up 10 years ago. All of a sudden, her bank in Costa Rica shuts down their account and says, you're a U.S. person in non-compliance. And she has to, how do you prove a negative? How do you prove, no, I'm not. I used to be, but I've stopped doing it. I'm a UK citizen, and UK is a little bit more civilized. They don't tax you based on your worldwide income. So she really had a nightmare, and she has, just a complete hatred. I mean, that's just the complete hatred for the United States. And then as she learns, and I think as we're learning, this doesn't even raise revenue. $800 million is nothing. It is absolutely nothing. And how they could actually... there's no accountability. And I mean, first of all, when all these pay-go things happen, and one of the new ones that they did do, another pay-go, was the passports. Yeah. Right, the passports. And also, they're going to do this, you're restricting the U.S. passports if you owe $50,000 or more, and you're not in some collection alternative, and then they're vague on what the collection alternative means.
Well, and if you say if you owe $50,000, no, if the IRS says you owe, I mean, you don't even have to be adjudicated or convicted of anything.
Yeah, exactly right. You could owe that, and here it is. And in the same PATH Act, they said, we're going to send out collection cases to third-party collection
Right.
agencies.
Because that's worked so well.
Because, right, I'm like, I've been doing this long enough to remember the last time that failed, and it wasn't that long ago. It was such a waste of time because you can't do both. You can't even come close to protecting constitutional rights about something so invasive as somebody's life to a third party. They can't do it. There's
Right.
way too much to do. There's way too much training to do. So they're just going to, they get to say it. And I guess that's what bothers me is there's no accountability to say, hey, who was the dummy who passed this one? It didn't work. You know how we knew it wasn't going to work? Because it didn't work before. So why was it going to work before? Why do you get credit for this offset that we know isn't going to happen?
Well, if you see what you're doing and it doesn't work and you keep trying it again, that's what they call insanity, I believe.
All right. So, Jim, I have a question for you. Do you think FATCA will ever go away?
You know, it's funny. Not too long after I got involved with FATCA, which was in 2011, I was approached by two of my then law partners from Frankfurt saying, Jim, what are we going to do about this FATCA? And of course I said, what's that? I'd never heard of it like anybody else in Washington. And when I looked into it, my first thought was, this is so nuts. Like I said, you could knock it over with a feather. Let's just, it should be self-evident. Get behind an effort. Let's knock this thing over. Of course, that didn't happen. I was told by the representative of one of the financial industry associations here in the United States, who were, of course, taking a walk on FATCA on their own because they didn't want to look like they were for tax evasion, and because for the domestic industry, they're not that concerned about the costs yet. It's only the withholding provisions, which, as it looks like now, they may never have to actually act on. But he told me he thought that FATCA eventually would go away, but only after it turned to a big god-awful disaster several years down the line, and then finally it would be quietly swept away. I don't know if he's right about that. I do think it will turn into a god-awful disaster. Whether at that point somebody will take it from FATCA, what's that, to FATCA, what a mess, we got to do something, it's a speculation. But unfortunately, it could have been nipped earlier in the bud, and it was not.
Now, I guess my feeling on FATCA was that it would just basically be a nuisance around paid by the direct cost paid by a few. So what are the things that you think are going to lead to the disaster?
A few things. One is, of course, when we talk about the costs, those costs are getting passed on to taxpayers, to primarily outside the United States, to consumers of financial institutions. They have to pay for this compliance somehow, and those costs are going to get passed on to somebody, and already are being passed on, but probably in a way that is not visible to the customers in most cases. I think there are a couple of things looming here. One is the question of reciprocity, that in these IGAs, the administration committed to seeking reciprocity for reporting to foreign governments from American domestic institutions, something they currently do not have the statutory authority for, although there's been speculation they might try to do it without explicit statutory authority and see if they get away with it. They haven't done that so far. But that means there would be costs comparable to those imposed on foreign financial institutions, on American banks, and then those would get passed on to consumers. There's also, I would say, the broader privacy issue. The question of what happens to all of this information if the tax recovery, as they call it, really is not all that substantial. What is the real benefit to the government here? One Treasury official I talked to expressed real puzzlement. Why would anybody be opposed to this? I mean, after all we want is information. Inquiring minds want to know. Let's look at it from the point of view of, let's be honest about it, a kind of a police state mentality. If government agencies could know everything about you, everything in your communications, every item in your house, they'd be perfectly happy to do that, because after all, if you haven't done anything wrong, what are you trying to hide? That's the mentality we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Keep in mind, by the way, that Senator Carl Levin, one of the primary sponsors of FATCA, was very explicit that the information recovered or provided via FATCA is not subject to the regulations that keep tax information confidential. If you're a taxpayer or a tax lawyer and you provide information to the IRS, that information can only be used for tax purposes. cannot be passed on to intelligence agencies. That's not true of FATCA, because the information coming from the foreign banks is not the taxpayers' information, nor is it a tax preparer's information. It's provided by the institution. So that information can be, and I believe will be, passed on to other government agencies. So to my mind, part of this is a metastasis of this surveillance state, which is becoming global in scope. And then the third thing that's related to that is the fact that FATCA and the IGAs are essentially a catalyst for the automatic exchange of information scheme that the OECD has been pushing for a very long time. So we are looking at a global information fishbowl here for not only the United States, but potentially other governments as well.
That's right. You know, these other, and I don't know if these other governments realize this, it's some might be lost on them, but they don't have universal tax jurisdiction. So if a non-U.S. person is investing in the United States, why do you care? Mm-hmm. You don't get anything anyway.
Yeah, that's right. Now, I suppose in principle, there are some countries that they tax residents, but some of them would tax the residents only for the income derived domestically in that country. Others would tax the resident for income they had in another country. So there are some countries that would say, okay, you're a resident of France. I don't know if this is the case with France, and you have assets in the United States. Since you're a resident in France, we will also tax those assets. We want the information. There's obviously some countries where people do hide money in the United States. In fact, that's now accelerating. There have been many articles about how the United States is now becoming the biggest tax haven in the world.
Yeah, they don't. The United States doesn't comply with FATCA. It doesn't. Nope.
No, we're not going to share. You want information?
No, it's sort of like when Woodrow Wilson thought up the League of Nations. Say, okay, you guys go do that now, but we're not going to join.
Well, Jim, I just want to thank you for joining us. Like I said, what we can do is just educate people and make them aware of the issue. And I think you're right. I think one of the best chances we have here of helping FATCA to go away is, if a country stands up. I think that's the biggest hope.
Well, I think the greatest quote I heard is it could be knocked over with a feather. We just don't have that feather. And so just a few key players to say, you know what? No. This is just not going to happen. We're not going to do it. And your $800 million, who's that person who's going to stand up like, well, in theory, we're supposed to get $800 million for the billions of dollars in compliance, and there's just not enough revenue you're going to get from it. Mm-hmm. And so I think if it can be pitched like that so that the politician who's against it is not the one who's for non-compliance. We're not for ridiculous paperwork that doesn't increase revenue.
It's a classic example of a bad law, a law that costs too much, is invasive, does not accomplish its purpose. How much worse can a law be? And undermines fundamental principles like privacy and sovereignty.
Well, I'm trying to think of an example of a worse law. That's what I'm trying to. I'm trying to think of. I can think of worse, really bad court decisions, and I'm trying to think of a law.
The only thing I can think of that comes close was prohibition.
Oh, amen, brother.
Yeah,
I'll take that.
Right, I would say, I would say that's about right. This is. Prohibition affected more people. That took some time to get away. This doesn't affect as many people directly, but wow, this. Yeah.
And given the magnitude of the costs here, and again, the whole feather issue, look, I sound like a broken record, but I think even now it is not too late. If it would be harder for maybe expats or individual citizens, easier for institutions, even easier probably for some, a few wealthy individuals. I mean, we're not talking about billions of dollars to get rid of FATCA. We're probably talking about maybe less than $1 million to get rid of FATCA, which is chump change compared to the compliance. Yeah, exactly right.
Well, now, Jim, can you start the political action campaign?
Well, indeed, after
I want to donate it. I want to donate to it.
Let me put it this way. What I don't want to do is I have been resisting the notion of basically passing the cup to individual small donors. I'm not Bernie Sanders here for asking for $27 because I don't think that's a fair thing on those individuals compared to the way the institutions are in fact subsidizing FATCA through the compliance with the big firms. So, I do think it would be best if at least an institution or two, or maybe some fairly wealthy individuals who could afford it, were to get behind it. I still think that is doable. And I'm perfectly happy to talk to anybody to do that and to work with other professionals that could help put together a viable campaign to essentially educate Congress and the rest of the political community here in Washington, which is really a village, come to think of it, that this is just a bad law.
Right. So we encourage everyone to visit repealfatca.com.
And if you happen to be that wealthy person, just trying to figure out what to do.
If you know Oprah,
they can get in touch with Jim at repealfatca.com.
Also, my Twitter at Jim Jatras, and also if you like my vice presidential ideas, hashtag Jim Jatras Veep.
Awesome. Well, Jim, best of luck with the VP nomination. When you win, you can come back on. We'll give you congratulations.
Wow, that will be.
Hey, we'll do the next one at the Naval Observatory.
Fantastic.
All right, Jim. Well, thank you so much for your time. Again, it's repealfatca.com. And thanks for listening to Parental Advisory.
Thank you.
IRSMedic, the law offices of Parent & Parent, LLP. Real tax attorneys for tough tax problems.